I'd like to introduce Paul Plummer. He is Professor and Co-Director of the Centre for Regional Development at University of Western Australia, and he is primarily a researcher who has experience in regional development and policy in Australia, US, UK and Japan. The second speaker will be Michael Kitzelmann in the centre there. He is the Chief Executive Officer at Etheridge Shire Council in far north Queensland, and he has over 24 years' experience in government and is well versed in the challenges associated with negotiating the systems, policies and priorities of government in order to achieve local objectives. Michael is a strong believer in driving positive change rather than working within the norm and reacting to situational-driven change, and he is passionate about the delivery of services and value adding to the community. Second from the far end, we have Rhys Williams. He is the 2015 West Australian of the Year and CEO at The Makers, a social innovation charity finding new ways to tackle big challenges in regional Western Australia. Rhys was one of the youngest Australians to serve a term as a local government councillor when he was elected to the Mandurah Council in 2009. He is an ambassador to the One Young World Global Leaders Summit and is chairman of the award-winning Mandurah Performing Arts Centre and of John Tonkin College, a secondary college based in the Peel region. He's a board member of Regional Development Australia Peel and has served 2 terms as board director of the Peel Development Commission. He has worked internationally in a number of community and economic development initiatives, including the development of a culture and creativity strategy for the regional area of the United Arab Emirates. On the far end, we have Laura Egan, who is the founder of Enterprise Learning Projects. Laura's passion is creating opportunities for people to achieve their aspirations through business. In 2010, she established Enterprise Learning Projects, a social enterprise that works in partnership with remote Aboriginal communities to develop inclusive, creative and sustainable enterprise-based initiatives that support family and community goals. Laura holds a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Commerce, postgraduate certificate in Indigenous Studies and a Cert 4 in Small Business Management. She was awarded the 2010 Social Entrepreneur of the Year by the School of Social Entrepreneurs and was selected as a Young Social Pioneer by the Foundation for Young Australians in 2012. She was recently awarded a scholarship to attend the 2016 Global Entrepreneurship Conference in Silicon Valley in the US. So without further ado, I'll ask Paul to tell us what he thinks are important and interesting issues that we could be discussing and considering at this conference. Paul. Either.
I'll stand up. Thank you, Geoff, and thank you for everybody for inviting me to come and share some thoughts with you today. I realise time is limited, so I'll stick to some questions that I raised, particularly as I had to rewrite what I'm going to talk last night based upon a very robust conversation that we had yesterday at a breakout group organised by the Department of Regional Development of Western Australia for researchers. The question I was going to ask or address here was the importance of evidence-based policy, or the importance for having evidence for making policy. But based upon yesterday's conversation at the end, I finally decided I didn't actually realise I didn't know what evidence-based policy actually was. So I'm going to try and answer that by saying, do we need evidence-based policy? And as a researcher, what is our role in this? And that's really, I think, comes out of really 2 questions here that were raised from yesterday is, first of all, what do we think evidence actually is? And I think a lot of people that work in this area conflate and confuse evidence with data or statistics or numbers. And I want to suggest that they're not exactly the same thing. In fact, they're not the same thing at all. And secondly, what role can, and indeed does, which are different questions, evidence-based or evidence have in policy formation and evaluation? And from my perspective as a researcher, there are really a number of threats to the validity of what we do when we're engaged with regional policy. And these come about through really the way in which we think about policy. And I'd like to argue here that there are three issues. The first of which is, it strikes me that a lot of policy is based upon what I would call fuzzy concepts, chaotic concepts, and buzzwords. And every conference I come to, I hear increasing numbers of buzzwords. You hear about the creative class, creatives, cultural capital, social capital, clusters. It sort of grows like topsy here. And from the perspective of a researcher engaged in, I engage in modelling, econometric modelling, these concepts are really too vague to be operationalised and let alone to be tested. So one of the issues we face when we're trying to get involved in evidence-based policy is that a lot of policy is not based upon evidence, I would argue, but based upon fuzzy concepts that really are not even testable in principle. So they're not even subject to evaluation through evidence. The second issue we face, and this is an issue I would add of supposedly an era of big data. Anyone working on regional Australia will know that the data that we have are very limited and very poor. They're limited in the sense that we have spatial coverage that changes dramatically over time. We have very short time series in which to evaluate things. And typically the data are collected for purposes other than those for which we want to actually use them. But the issue I want to address and focus on more today is how we bridge the gap between these fuzzy concepts and fuzzy theories and the poor data that we have, or what in academic terms we call what is the logic of inference. How do we move from data to theory or theory to data? And I want to raise this in the context of work we've been doing in Western Australia with, again, something that is another buzzword and a fuzzy concept, and that's the notion of resilience, or particularly the notions of resilience and competitiveness. And in my other life, I also do work with groups of ecologists who have very different notions of what resilience is. And so we're trying to sort of triangulate what these are and come up with ways in which to test for resilience. And in the Western Australian context, we've come up with a series of models to look at what's been happening to the Western Australian economy over the last 40 years. And I'd like to suggest to you or give you 4 pieces of, shall we say, information. You get to choose whether you call them evidence or not later. The first of which is, and in contrast to what economic theory might predict for us, over time, over the last 40 years, the Western Australian economy, spatially and regionally, has become more divergent. That is, more uneven. There is no notion that poor places are catching up with richer places. There's more inequality across space. The second is that, as defined, these economies are actually really quite resilient in the sense that if there's a shock to the system, like the global financial crisis or the downturn in the mining boom, that the economies react relatively rapidly to go back to their long-run developmental trajectories. So that's the good news. But the third piece of information is that over the last 40 years, typically those long-run trajectories have not changed at all in the face of all external changes in the economy, in the face of different policy regimes. And as I'm limited for time, I'd like to, those are 3 or 4 pieces of information that you have. And in terms of whether you think evidence-based policy is applicable or useful for those of you practicing or working in regional Australia, I'd like to pose 3 questions for us to address. The first is, what do you believe now that you have this information, now that you have this data? The second question is, what should you do now that you have this information and data? And the third is, how should I interpret the data as evidence when regarding different competing theories or different competing policies? And I would like to argue strongly that the sort of research you can do in evidence-based policy has a role in this, in that it has a destructive role in the sense that it can help us eliminate poor theories and poor explanations and poor policies. But it also has a constructive role, and this is one of my reasons I'm involved in regional analysis, is that it's not just a one-way track from testing theories to policy. There's a very real sense in that when we have policy interventions in the economy, we can use those to evaluate the appropriateness of our theories by establishing which relationships remain stable in the face of these policy interventions. And I'd just like to leave it there for now and open those questions up. Thank you.
Okay, now Michael, what do you think is important or interesting for us in regional development? And you can use the microphone if you like to walk around.
Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know where Etheridge Shire is, it is in the far north of Queensland, approximately 5 hours west of Cairns. The Shire covers approximately 40,000 square kilometres, and we have a population of just under 1,000 people. So very, very similar to the vast majority of Western Australian councils, Northern Territory councils, and remote councils across Australia. One of the things which, in the 2.5 years I've been at Etheridge Shire, which has become very, very apparent, is that no matter where you come from in Australia, the capacity of a local government authority varies greatly from those in the city areas. Local government authorities in regional areas, in remote areas, do not have the same abilities to respond to challenges that the city areas do, simply because they do not have the numbers to man all of the jobs that need to be done. Most officers in a local government authority actually conduct 4 or 5 roles, whereas our city counterparts will have 4 or 5 people for each role. It shows the diversity and the strength and the ability of local authorities in regional areas to just get on and get the job done. And that's what SEGRA is really about. It's about how do we get on and get the job done. It's not about talking head conferences, it's about developing strategies of how we can move forward. So some of the things I'd like to get you to think about during the conference and to discuss with each other is how can we collaborate with each other to give each other the support we need to achieve the outcomes. The collaboration between local authorities, all 3 levels of government working together, private industry are the only way we're going to succeed. Some examples of that is, for those of you who have been to the last SEGRA conference, you will have noticed that I put up a challenge around safe, secure and sustainable water for remote and regional Australia. In that challenge, the inspiration behind it was the little township that I came from was having major problems with water quality. With limited resources, we were struggling to address the issue. However, with collaboration with our neighbouring Shire, we actually managed to fix the water problem for less than 1/3 of the cost if we had have gone out to market to do it directly. Out of that, not only did we resolve the problems for our local community at a much better value for money prospect, but we managed to achieve engineering excellence and were recognised for a Institute of Public Works and Engineering Australasia Engineering Excellence Award. Now, it's a mouthful there what the award was, but the key to that is that wasn't through one local government authority working on its own. That was through collaboration with the state government, Richmond Shire, one of our neighbouring shires, and with private industry to achieve the outcome. A $1.5 million water treatment plant was implemented and installed in the township of Georgetown for just under $387,000. Collaboration is the key to success for remote and regional communities. Those relationships with our neighbours, with local industries and with government are critical to us achieving what we need to achieve. We've got some big challenges, but that means we've got big opportunities, and the way to achieve it is by working together. A couple of days ago, I was sitting down with my mayor, who's one of the most driven, most passionate leaders in development for our community that I've ever seen. I struggle to keep up with the man. He works 80+ hours a week as well as running his own businesses. Now, one of the discussions we had was that it's council's job to be an enabler for development. And the mayor very, very quickly turned around and said, no, it's not. We can't be enablers. Enabling is not enough. We need to drive development. Big difference between enabling and driving. And the simple fact is, the days of working on the theory of councils about roads, rates and rubbish, they're long gone. The theory of build it and they will come is no longer relevant. For development to occur in remote and regional communities, we need to drive that development. We need to be the ones going out there and getting the opportunities and making them happen. Every big corporate in the world has specialists around business development to drive their business growth. So why aren't we as local authorities and local communities doing exactly the same thing? So it was a very, very inspiring conversation with the Mayor when we went through that, and the fact that I was even thinking that as an enabler, I was ahead of the pack. Whereas in actual fact, I was lagging behind where we needed to be. So it's about driving development, driving opportunities. With that, one of the things that we recently had, and a lot of you here would have seen the announcements in the media about the GenX project in far north Queensland. It is a hydroelectricity project and a solar farm project. It's an absolutely amazing project. They've taken the Kitzelmann gold mine, which was Australia's largest open-cut gold mine, and they've taken that mine, which had not been rehabilitated, and turned it into a renewable energy generation. A 350 hectare solar farm at 150 megawatts of solar energy. The two open cut pits for the mine, which are now full of water, are going to be used for hydroelectricity generation. That is inspirational, taking something that was effectively a bit of a tragedy how it was being left, to such a positive repurposed outcome for Queensland and for our community. But the key here is, earlier I mentioned about collaboration and how important it is. When the GenX team came over to council and started the conversation, they made a comment that they were hoping to get their project to be a coordinated general project by the Queensland Government. To do that, they would then be able to put in bids for the renewable energy targets, etc. But they had a very limited timeline on how they would do that. They had to turn a piece of freehold land and a piece of leasehold land, which had a mining lease sitting over the top of it, change the tenure, go through the development approval process, the environmental process, and be recognised in a very short time. This is where collaboration comes in. I sent my engineer and my building and planning manager to Townsville to sit down with their engineers. We didn't wait for them to fill out their application. We sent our team to sit down and go through it with them to ensure that the application, when it was presented, had everything it required. And for those of you in local government, that project, a very complex project, was approved without a single objection from the community or government in just under 3 months, 2 days shy of 3 months. That sort of thing traditionally takes up to 12 months. Collaboration, partnership with our local community, with government is critical. Partnership with our private industry is critical if we want to drive development. Then the last one I would like to point out is, we were just talking about policy a few moments ago and talking about research and how it is used. With the government of today, they are now making policy to support regional Australia. It is our job as leaders in those communities to take that policy and make it work. We have to look at it, find the opportunities and make it work. One of the best things about the SEGRA conference is here is an opportunity that we can provide feedback to the policymakers about where the gaps are, what we need. And that's the challenge that I would put to every single one of you here. While you're at conference, where the gaps are, don't identify the problem, identify what we need to do so that we can make it change, so that we can grow and really show the rest of Australia that it is in regional Australia where it all happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So, Rhys, would you like to share your thoughts with us?
Thanks very much, and first of all, congratulations to SEGRA, and welcome to all of the people that have travelled from interstate to the best state in Western Australia, in the country. We're glad to have you here in Western Australia. Also, we've been happy to help out in terms of your economies, but if you don't mind on the way out, we'd like some of our GST back. The Minister didn't mention it, but if you could help us out with that, we'd be very grateful. Look, what I want to focus on, I guess, is to talk to you about the importance of growing and enhancing leadership in regional areas, and ensuring that we create those pipelines for people who are not only the future leaders of our community, but the leaders right now in our community, to be able to thrive and be the best that they can be. So by quick show of hands, if you're a leader in your region, or you consider yourself someone of influence or someone that can get some things done, could you just put your hands up for me, please? So good to see that we've got such a packed room of leaders, packed number of leaders in the room. I guess just put your hand up again if out of all of those people, you feel like there was somebody or a group of people that were able to support you, to be able to give you some guidance, to be able to tap you on the shoulder and suggest that you might take up this role in your leadership journeys. Just put your hand up if that's you. So just about every person in the room that's identified themselves as a leader has also been able to identify that for most of us that journey starts because somebody has the faith in us, has the belief in us to say, hey, you should give this a go. And I think that that's a really important prospect because, you know, as we know, they're challenging times. In Australia right now, as the current adult cohort, you know, we're the most addicted, the most medicated, the most stressed out, the most obese, and the most unhappy generation in human history. And so for us, I think as a country and as a world, we've got lots of things to think about. Now, I'm an eternal optimist, and so I don't think that there's any reason that that should mean we should give up. But whilst we need to think very specifically about how well we plan in our regions, how well we plan as a nation, both looking at grassroots innovation and having that higher level macro policy that sets an agenda for us to thrive as a nation, we also have to remember that one of the most fundamental assets in particular that we have in regional areas is our human capital. And we need to think about how we, as regional Australia, ensure that we're creating opportunities for new people, new ideas, and new concepts to come through our regions and do really well. Often in our regional areas, what we identify is that it's the same 30 people that have been on every board and every committee and the council for the past 30 years. And I think that's really important because that wisdom and that experience is essential if we're going to not make the mistakes of the past. But it's really, really important alongside that we're doing the best that we can to be able to create a framework where new ideas and new people can come through and thrive and do well. I'm not just talking about young people, I'm talking about all people that want to take up their leadership journey. For myself, I've grown up in a regional area, Mandurah, thank you Minister, the biggest regional centre in Western Australia and very much a region in its own right, the Peel region. And for us as a region, you know, we are facing some, like a lot of you, key challenges around higher rates of unemployment, sometimes double that of our cities, facing challenges around social dysfunction, facing challenges around how we balance increasing our industry footprint and also protecting our environmental assets. And to be able to ensure that we can do all of those things in the most contemporary and the most efficient and the most innovative way possible, we need to have a diversity of thinkers around the table who come from all different walks of life and all different backgrounds. And so I guess the notion that I put to you as a conference here today representing regional Australia is so often when we think about young people, we think about the problem of youth. So often when we think about the challenges of our environment, we think about the problems that we have to face. So often when we think about gender diversity or any type of cultural diversity, we think about how that is a problem for us. But let's, as a conference over the next couple of days, and indeed when we go back into our communities, see that those opportunities and those assets are actually the way that we ensure that we go forward and address some of the key challenges that we've got. They're not challenges, they're opportunities, and it's going to be essential that we tap into those assets from a leadership point of view to be able to do well in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rhys. So just to interpret for those of you who are from over east, as they say here, three big topics of conversation in WA. One is Australian rules football, and that only concerns two teams, not any others. How great the scenery is, and the GST. Now, I'd like to call on Laura to give her point of view, please.
Thank you. I'd like to speak this morning on the theme of economic inclusion. So that's the equality of opportunity for everyone to participate in and to contribute to economic life. And as we know, in our regions, in our towns, there are some people on the margins. So I'd like you to think about who in your areas might not have as many seats at the table. So in the Katherine region and ELP, we work with Indigenous people, and they've traditionally been very excluded from the economy. But we also know women, young people, people with disabilities. And I also would like to challenge you to reframe that away from a problem that needs to be solved, but rather an opportunity to be harnessed. The economic value of that can be unlocked through harnessing diversity is immense. People with different ways of seeing the world, of being in the world, will have different ideas and see different possibilities. And I'd like to share a story of one of the communities that we work with, Minieri community, southeast of Katherine. High unemployment, about 200 people there registered for work for the dole. And we were working with them and asking them, what are your assets? What are you passionate about? What are some opportunities in your area? And they spoke really passionately about their culture and were sharing their local bush medicine with us. And they call it gulban. And they came to us and said, here, you should try it. You can boil it up and drink it as a tea. And so we did, and we sat down, we had tea, and I asked them, here we're talking business, we're talking opportunities. Have you ever thought about a tea business? And they said, no, but we can. That gulban grows everywhere. And so now we're on a journey with them to support them to commercialise that as a tea and to share that with Australia and the world. So I guess that's just one example of something that I would never have thought of. It's not my culture, it's not my land, but being able to harness that cultural capital and those land assets in a way that creates opportunities. And, no one really would have thought that the tea industry, could be activated from this tiny community, but here they are tapping into that. The factors underlying economic exclusion are often complex and systemic, historical, geographical, social, economic. And I guess, for all of us, deepening our understanding of those as we go really helps us to enable, bringing others to the table. Working together with marginalised groups to design and implement policies and initiatives is of utmost importance. I think spaces to co-design policies and to implement them in a way that's inclusive is really important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. So to round out our first round of what our panellists think is important, I ask Jen to speak, please.
It's going to be an interesting conversation over the next few days. One of the things I want to pick up on in terms of policy, the way that it's developed, how it rolls out, and what it means for all of us in regional Australia is this idea of localism. Now, localism as a policy response to regional development has been the policy of successive governments of various persuasion over the last little while. And this idea has come out of the thinking of OECD countries. And in large part, they're countries like Britain and places in Europe where the populations are vastly different, the geography is vastly different, and yet at times it seems like we pick up some of that thinking and transplant it to the Australian context and then wonder why it may not be working so well in some places. So this idea of localism is the idea that local people can and should take responsibility for their own economic futures. And it's based on the premise that we know our own backyards best. And that to some extent is absolutely true. And from that perspective, this idea of localism as a policy for regional Australia has very much merit. You might ask, well, so what's the problem? Well, one of the problems is that localism assumes that local areas, that regions have an asset base from which to create economic opportunities. So it makes that assumption already that there is something that you can do, that there is something that you can build on, that you have something in your region that you can build on to grow economic development. One of the other challenges is that this idea of localism as a policy exists in an environment of centralised policy command and control. So we've got this idea, if you think about it, we've got this idea that we need to be responsible for our own futures, but at the same time, that operates in a policy space that hasn't been decentralised in that regard. The other idea of localism is that, and picking up points of my colleagues, where's the evidence? There may well be some, it works in other places, but do we have the evidence base for localism? I'm not saying we don't, but where is it and how's that getting out there? Localism also assumes that there is capacity in rural, regional and remote communities to take these ideas and run with them. And we all know that that's not necessarily the case. Localism also assumes that the community leadership and the voices that are being heard at that local level are broadly representative of community views. And I was pleased to see that one of the challenges this afternoon is about how we can create more diversity and get more representation on our boards and committees across rural, regional and remote Australia. And that's really important because the voices who might be out there suggesting what it is that we need in regional Australia, they may well be representative, but they may well not be. And in my experience, often it's people like us, or PLUs as I tend to call them, who are representative on those boards and committees. And I suppose one of the conversations I think we need to have in terms of that policy space is how do we get PLUs, which is people unlike us, to have their say in what happens in regional Australia. So my challenge, if you like, my questions, conversation that we need to have is local development does need to be supported by regional development policy that A, recognises difference. Regions are about agriculture, sure, but they're also about industrial development. They're about tourism. They're about the service sector, which is huge in regional Australia. They're about energy generation. So we need to be thinking about that difference when we're actually formulating policy. Regions need to be resourced. You cannot have localism as a policy goal where that is not properly resourced and where you have local bodies properly resourced to be able to drive that local development. Those bodies need to be connected. We, across regional Australia, need to be connected. Whether you're an RDA, whether you're a council, Shire, whatever you are, Development Commission, we actually need to be connected across regional Australia. And on that note, I'll finish. But my question is, what is the message that we need to be taking back to all levels of government in terms of support, proper support for localism as a policy goal?
Thank you, Jen. And of course, I actually very rudely overlooked the introduction to Jen, who is Chair of the RDA Far North in South Australia, Chair of the National RDA Chairs Reference Group, and she is a geographer in the Centre for Global Food and Resources at University of Adelaide, holds an executive position in Cente Care Country, South Australia, and an honorary position as Adjunct Associate Professor at the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis at the University of Canberra. She is also on the SEGRA National Steering Committee, and of course we're a bit like a family, and you do neglect your family, so sorry Jen there for missing that introduction altogether. So very quickly now, we'd like to provide the opportunity, having all the speakers listen to each other's points, for a short kind of summing up or perhaps addition to what they said before. Paul.
Gosh, there's so much to say, really. Summing up, I think I would say really two things. The first is that I think there is a real issue here around issues of collaboration and diversity of thinking, and how to try to bridge the gaps between the ways in which, for example, someone like myself thinks about the world, and the way that you think about the world and the way you think about the world. And how do we have a meaningful dialogue about that? Because often I think, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone, is it ends up as being a dialogue of the deaf, and at best we all just agree to disagree, which I don't think is very helpful. The second is, and I very much second the idea, and I probably should have said this in my talk, is this notion that somehow we should be borrowing and transferring policies taken in a very different context. And again, this supports evidence-based policy, because all the evidence we suggest is when you take theories developed in North America and Europe, they're not actually confirmed by the evidence of what's happening in Australia. Or to put in my terms, they're refuted by the data. Yeah. So the evidence shows that we should not be actually borrowing these theories.
Yeah. Michael.
First of all, just very quickly, Rhys's comments about the importance of leadership cannot be understated. I mentioned a moment ago about the Mayor, how he is so driven and passionate about driving development in our Shire. I can't miss the opportunity to spruik a little bit about how great Etheridge Shire is by giving you one example of how that driving development is occurring. Along the Etheridge Shire, there's the catchment of Gilbert River, and it pretty much encompasses the boundaries of the Shire. But along there's been extensive amount of work conducted by CSIRO and the Mayor when he was in last time as Mayor, and it was identified as a prime agricultural area. The owners of the properties along that riverbed, where the prime agricultural land they've got varying levels of capacity to actually develop their property into agriculture. We don't want that project to fail. So as a local authority, we are taking a leadership role in that development area. The community has asked for council to be the leaders of that development area, and we're actually working to have it identified as a state significant development area. And that is council operating commercially on behalf of its local economy. Most of the councils in remote and regional Australia are welfare dependent, i.e. we don't raise enough money for our rates, etc. to cover our expenses, and we're reliant on grants from a federal and state government. That cannot go on because there's always a limited number of money, and we need to start to be the masters of our own destiny as local communities. And that's the challenge that we're taking on board. How do we drive that? And it is leadership, it's inspiration, and most importantly, it's about getting on with the job and making it happen. And for all of those in Western Australia, I must apologise up front now. You have an absolutely amazing agricultural precinct on the Ord River scheme. It's very large, 29,000 acres. Our goal is we're going to overtake that, and Queensland is going to have the largest and best agricultural area.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The challenge is clear. Rhys.
Well, thanks very much to the fellow panellists. I would say three key points to sum up. The first one is on leadership. I think the message has gotten confused around what leadership actually is. It's not a program that we can sign up to or send someone to do. Leadership is about standing up and taking the lead and doing something. And sometimes we need someone to tap us on the shoulder and say, like I said earlier, I believe in you enough to support you to do this. For myself, as a 19-year-old having no understanding of economics or regional development. Someone in our community said to me, I think you should come and stand for the RDA board position because you're involved in some youth projects. And that led me to study economics at university, to run for council despite having never been to a council meeting before. That was crazy. To get involved in, and then being on council has led to other opportunities because someone at the start had the foresight to be able to say, you know, you should give this a go. And so yesterday in some of the dialogues during the RDA forum, there were lots of people saying, yeah, but we don't have a critical mass of people in our community that are ready to take the lead. Just ask one person to take the lead. We've all got examples of mentors and people that have helped us. So just be that person to one other person and sort of watch what happens from there. The second thing that I would say is, don't underestimate how many people in your community have huge capacity that you don't know about. In my hometown of Mandurah, you know, we've kind of been going through this time of transition and change, but had made the assumption that in our community, you know, we knew who the leaders were, and so it was about focusing on helping those leaders to be better. A little while ago, at the beginning of 2014, the non-profit that I run, we opened up a co-working and innovation hub to try and see who else was in the community that could be supported in their entrepreneurship endeavours and in their leadership aspirations. And what we found is there was a huge number of people that lived in our community that were running businesses on a global scale, that were, you know, doing the most remarkable things. And no one had ever heard from them before because they didn't have a place where they could connect with each other and share like-minded stories and create peer groups. And so I guess that second point is you just don't know who's out there until you actually create mechanisms for those people to come and be engaged. This is not about apathy. Our lack of regional leadership is not about apathy. It's about not always having those pipelines and those contexts that people want to connect to. And the third, and I think the most fundamental point, especially around engaging with young leadership, is it's meant to be hard. It's always been hard. Young people have always found older people to be intimidating, and older people have always found younger people to be immature and difficult. It's always been that way, but we overcome that through showing empathy, through having understanding, and through remembering that all of our journeys started somewhere. I remember on the night that I was elected to council, a former councillor came over to me and said, "Don't worry, we've checked. There's a kids menu, so you should be fine." And that was my first introduction to local government council. But actually, in that 4 years as a local government councillor, I reckon I got about 40 years worth of life experience. Had the opportunity to develop some amazing relationships with some mentors who have given me so many other opportunities to be able to learn about such a huge range of different issues. And that all started because someone at some stage said, you know, I think you should. So it's meant to be difficult, but go back into your communities and find those people that you think, you know, may be able to contribute something to your community and just ask them to be involved. It'll be challenging, it'll be difficult. It's not just about getting a kid to join your board so they can run your social media platform. It's about meaningful engagement and opening up those opportunities as someone did for you.
Thank you, Rhys. As someone who works in a university, I don't think those leadership courses are going away anytime soon, unfortunately. Laura.
I think having a predisposition to having a go, making things happen, trying and testing and approaching things with an action learning sort of philosophy, and then really, you know, teasing out policies. Is this working? If not, let's go back to the drawing board, but real action. And then in the action, you have the collaboration, you have the leadership, you have the informing of policy and testing that theory and practice, the sort of praxis, the coming together of those two.
Thank you, Laura. Jen, to finish.
Isn't it wonderful? I always get the last word. I don't know how that happens. Look, I think all the points that have been made by all of the speakers here this morning are critically important. And sure, there are differences across regions. There are differences across people's view of the world. I think for regional Australia, our common thread, our commonality, if you like, is some P words: passion, pride, people, personalities, and most importantly, place. And picking up on what others have said, I think those conversations around how you engage others, and Rhys's point about it's not necessarily young people, it could be older people, it could be somebody in the community who, if you ask them, well, why haven't you taken up a leadership position? The answer could well be because nobody asked me. So when we go away from here and back to our communities, in supporting the policies that we live within, the policy environment in which we live, think about that, and let's not any of our places be the places where people say, because nobody asked me. So I'll finish there.
Okay. Well, I'd like you to thank all of our panellists for this great start to the conference.